Thank you, Edward. That's great. Thank you very much. And welcome, everybody. I hope you're all in the right place this afternoon. Yes, web accessibility for leaders. My name is John Kelly. I'm going to talk a little bit now and then hand you over to Richard Morton, who'll shine some light on the regulations and how they affect us as colleges and universities. This short session is for those who know little or nothing about the new website accessibility regulations. Just to give them their full title, the Public Sector Bodies, Websites and Mobile Applications Number 2 Accessibility Regulations 2018. As I say, this is an introductory session, and if you're already familiar with or working to implement the new regulations, then this may be going over some old ground. Although hopefully you'll still find it useful, and hopefully you'll find something to help you to win the fight to have the regulations taken on at an appropriate level in your organization. The running order today is Richard Morton will speak, who's from the Government Digital Service. He'll talk about what the regulations are, what they mean for how content is published on websites and learning platforms. I'll then talk a little bit about the accessibility statement requirements and what needs to be done there. And my colleague Julia Taylor will bring us on from that, hopefully, to the big picture and putting it all together and what we should be doing next. As Edward mentioned, there's an option for you to comment and ask questions in the chat pane, and feel free to answer some of them and get involved in the discussion. It adds to the value of the session today. We'll be keeping an eye on that, but as you can imagine, it won't be possible to answer all the questions. However, we're very fortunate to have a very active and enthused Jisc accessibility email list, which is the place for questions and discussion and sharing good practice as we approach the implementation of the regulations. And if you're not on that yourself, then make sure that someone at your institution is signed up. All the details, links to email, all the links to email lists, training, guidance, etc., are available from the Jisc accessibility webpage, jisc.ac.uk/accessibility. As I said, this is a short session and we haven't a lot of time and there's a lot to cover, so let's keep moving. I consider us very lucky to have Richard Morton with us. He's, as Edward said, a senior accessibility specialist at the GDS, as we know them, which is part of the Cabinet Office. And he's kindly taken time out from his busy schedule to join us and to get us up to speed. And I'm going to hand you over now to Richard. Are you able to
thanks, John.
Take it from there, Richard, please?
I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Richard Morton. As John said and Ed said, I'm part of the Government Digital Service, Senior Accessibility Specialist, part of the accessibility team there, which is part of the Cabinet Office, and I'm involved in increasing awareness of accessibility, understanding of the regulations and understanding of the web content accessibility guidelines, and basically making sure that government websites in particular, but now the wider public sector as well, make things as accessible as possible. Obviously, I am focusing on the regulations for this talk, but my brief in government is a lot more than that, and we do have some additional requirements that we make for government services. We're trying to make things as inclusive as possible. So some of what I do is more best practice rather than the actual specifics of the web content accessibility guidelines, but I'll try and focus on the particular requirements of the regulations for this talk. Just going to move the slide on. Okay, so new accessibility regulations. Just a bit about what they're about and how they're going to apply to you yourselves. First of all, from a general point of view, what we're trying to consider here, and this is part of the web content accessibility guidelines, is human capability across a wide range. So in these areas of vision, hearing, speech, motor skills, and cognitive abilities, there is a complete wide range of abilities in each of those, and we need to cater for those. As government, we need to meet the needs of every citizen. As you know, higher education organisations, you need to meet the needs of a lot of people across a wide range of capabilities. So what about compliance? What does that involve? What's got to be done? Well, in essence, all public sector bodies must make their websites and mobile apps more accessible by making them perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Now, what does that mean? These are the principles of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the accessibility principles. And perceivable means you need to be able to get information about a web page through one of your senses. One of the three senses, in fact, are either sight, hearing, or touch. Sight is the obvious one. Hearing, obviously, if it's any kind of audio content, or if for someone using screen reader software, it might be blind. And then touch would be something like a braille device, particularly for someone who's deaf-blind, who might use that sort of means of perceiving information. The second principle, it needs to be operable, and operable just means that you need to be able to operate the interaction controls, things like links, browser controls, buttons, form controls, media player controls. All of those need to be operable, but by the means that you have available to you, which may be you can use a mouse, you can use a trackpad, you can use a touchscreen, but maybe not. It might be you can only use a keyboard, or you might have times when you can use a mouse, but other times you can't, or you can't use it very well because of things like a tremor, or you might be using voice interaction instead to operate things, or some kind of assistive device like a head mouse, those sort of devices. So it needs to be operable in a way that people can use it themselves. Third principle there is it needs to be understandable. So I could show you a WK page in lots of different languages, say Chinese, for example, Mandarin Chinese. I could show you that. And if you don't understand Mandarin Chinese, you could perceive the information through your senses, but you wouldn't be able to understand it, or you might not be able to understand all of it. So understandability is an important aspect, and one of the principles we have as government is to say, as far as possible, use plain English. If you use things like terminology and abbreviations and acronyms, you need to explain them, unless they're so common that everybody knows them. That sort of principle. But use of good language helps everyone. Simple language helps everyone, particularly if it's someone with English as a second language, and obviously a lot of foreign language students, but also that impacts on people who may use sign language. So someone who's been deaf from birth is like to use sign language. They're less likely to understand English as the first language. That's likely to be their second language. So being understandable is important. And then the fourth principle is it needs to be robust, and that just means it needs to work on the technologies that people use, whether that's across different platforms, different browsers, but also across different assistive technologies. So things like screen readers, things like voice recognition, Zoom, magnifiers, but also the different brands of those, the different versions, older versions of browsers, not necessarily every single version or combination. It isn't possible to make things work across all different combinations, but a representative sample of what people use. Obviously, in a sort of enclosed environment like an internet, you may be able to have some knowledge of what browsers people are using, but generally things are pretty open and free these days, and people can be using things across a wide range of technologies. Okay, so to meet the requirements, in essence, you need to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1 at level AA, and that means meeting all the requirements at level A and then all the requirements at level AA, and there are 50 different success criteria for those. I'm not going to go through those, but there is a lot of detailed information available about those, and we've got some information on the Gov UK sites as well that helps understand some of that content a bit better. It's not technically the only way of meeting regulations, but it's the only realistic way. You need to meet these. And these were published last June, but they were an update from version 2. So there are some additional requirements that went in last June that are mainly to do with mobile devices, things like making sure that something will work in either orientation on the device, that sort of thing. So there are some additional requirements, but nothing major. Okay, so I say public sector bodies. Most public sector bodies, there are some exceptions, but in terms of higher education, that's going to be everyone really. There are some exceptions for broadcasters aren't included, and schools have some limited needs to meet the regulations. But in terms of higher education, you're all going to be involved in this, and it's all about being publicly funded, basically. So you need to evaluate the accessibility of your websites and applications. You need to fix issues. So if there are problems, you need to fix them with some exceptions. So there are things like disproportionate burden, which you can use as a defence. If you believe that something is disproportionate, if you're a very small organisation, you have very limited resources, or you have a lot of content to fix, those sort of things, you may be able to use that, but you would have to do a proper assessment of that in terms of cost, size, organisation resources, and the way that your systems and information are being used by people with disabilities particularly. You can't use excuses like we don't know how to do it, or it's not a priority for us, those sort of things, but there are ways of doing that. You also need to publish an accessibility statement, and as John said, he's going to be talking a bit more about what's needed in that. I won't go into great detail on that, but I'll talk a little bit about that. One thing that's useful to know is that GDS will be providing accessibility statement templates for people to use. That's hopefully going to happen in the next few weeks. There's no definite timeline for that, other than it'll need to be in place before September for the for the regulations. So that's hopefully coming out fairly soon. In essence, you're going to be legally responsible for meeting the accessibility standards, and that applies even if you've outsourced your website to a supplier. I'm sure many organisations do that. It's not up to the supplier to be accessible or to prove they're accessible or anything. It's up to you to make sure that your supplier is making things accessible if you're outsourcing or if you're using any kind of third-party software. The timelines, hopefully you're aware of the general timelines, which these came into force from last year, from September. So any new websites will need to be compliant by 23rd of September this year. Any existing websites will need to be compliant by 23rd of September 2020. Now, there isn't a strict definition of what the difference between a new and an existing website is in the regulations as such. So you're going to have to sort of interpret that in your own way. But it's probably pretty clear that if you've got an existing system and you're making changes to it, if you're making major changes to a website or a service, that may class as a new website, but it is up to you to decide what that is. And then there's a last one is mobile apps need to be compliant by 23rd of June 2021. They've decided in the regulations to give a bit more time for mobile applications to allow for that extra work to be done. Okay, so that's the compliance side of things, what you've got to do. Then there will be monitoring going on, and there will be a monitoring body. And the monitoring body will be within GDS, within the Government Digital Service. There will be a team who will be independent or semi-independent from the rest of the GDS accessibility team. They will be doing the monitoring. They will also be providing things like guidance and some training resources and general support. So it isn't just the stick approach, if you like, it's the carrot approach of providing help and providing support and trying to collaborate with people to improve things, because we're all in this together. But there will be, monitoring, formal monitoring going on, and the way that will work is there will be a number of sites tested each year, which will be taken from a random or semi-random sampling. There will be many sites that are tested on different basis. First of all, there'll be some that are done on a simple or simplex test basis. This will be a very minimal sort of test of probably thousands of websites. That will test a few pages on each website, and it will do things using automated testing plus a few manual checks. So it is very limited testing. It's not a full web content accessibility audit, but it will find, a number of issues, no doubt, based on things that we've done in the past with this, with internal services and things like that. If you're not aware already, automated testing tools are very useful at finding issues with websites, but they're very limited. So they can only, we estimate they only find between 20 and 30% of potential issues. An obvious thing that an automated tool can't really establish at the moment is whether the alternative text from an image is appropriate, for example, or even needed. It can test for the code that's there and make sure the appropriate attributes are there and things like that, but there are a number of things that it can't test. So it's a sort of very useful tool, and it filters out a lot of basic issues that may come in through coding or through changes, but it can't do everything. So some manual checking as well. Automated tools can't do things like checking for keyboard access, for example. So there may be some elements of that within the manual tests. So those are simple tests that will run on probably thousands of websites. And then there will be some more detailed tests, and this will be in the hundreds in terms of numbers of websites, which will be a full web content accessibility guidelines 2.1 audit to level AA on a sample of pages for each site that's chosen. That sample of pages will be based on things like common functionality, specific types of pages like contact pages and accessibility statements, but also things that are functional processes that people go through, that sort of thing. So there'll be a lot of, there'll be follow through on some pages to make sure that the whole process can be followed accessibly. So these will be tested, reported on, and results fed back. And in terms of enforcement, GDS won't be the enforcement body. The enforcement body is the Equality and Human Rights Commission, or in Northern Ireland is the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland. They will be responsible for enforcing things in the same way that they currently are for the Equality Act. So there will be a relationship between GDS monitoring body and the Equality and Human Rights Commission in terms of that, and then they will be managing the enforcement side of this. So what are the risks? Risks, obviously, no risks if you make your website fully accessible. The risks if you don't could include things like obviously being in breach of the law and whatever consequences come out of that from the enforcement body. But I think a bigger factor might be from that might be reputation. Obviously, you don't want to be seen to be an organisation that is breaking the law or is not dealing with any kind of enforcement notices. So reputation, I think, is going to be a big factor. And then I suppose possibly even bigger is that you rely on people being able to access your services. If they can't, then they may not even come to your services. So students, staff, and maybe even stakeholders, funders who can't access things, you may end up losing some of them because they just cannot access your services. It's not necessarily that they have to access everything through web services, provided you can provide the appropriate reasonable adjustments. It's the same as if you're employing somebody, you need to make sure you've got reasonable adjustments in place. But the more you can make people do things independently without additional support, the better it is for them, but also the better it is for you as an organisation. It saves time, saves money, and it's better for us sort of from an ethical point of view. The new regulations don't replace the Equality Act, or they don't supersede it, they just add to it in effect. The Equality Act is still in place, and that says all organisations, not just public sector, have a legal obligation to provide equal access to people with disabilities. So you can't discriminate against someone on the basis of disability, and discrimination could include something like a barrier on your website that someone who's blind can't access, or someone who's deaf can't get the audio content from something, or someone can't complete a form because of an accessibility problem. Those are sort of barriers that people might face, and that could be construed as discrimination. And that doesn't go away by this legislation. It's still there. The public sector equality duty also still applies, which is obviously for public sector organisations, and all that effectively says is that as public sector organisations, we have to be proactive in doing this. Commercial organisations, others, charities, those sort of organisations can be more reactive. But in terms of public sector, there is a requirement to be proactive. to make sure that things are accessible up front as far as possible. What about guidance and resources? Obviously, there are the regulations documents. There are some links available in this presentation for people who want to get some of this guidance. I've linked to a few things, including the regulations. We've got a more useful, I guess, summary of the regulations, the specific requirements, and that talks about what it talks about in terms of timescales. It talks a bit about the accessibility statements. It talks about some of the exemptions and other things that you need to know. And thinking about things like exemptions, I can just go through a couple of those. There are exemptions for any pre-recorded audio and video that's published before 23rd of September 2020. So what that means is you need to provide captions for video, you need to provide transcripts for audio, preferably both for video. But if you've published those before 23rd of September 2020, for the regulations, you don't have to do that. Obviously, best practice says you should, and you should be putting that in place now to make sure all your videos and audios are appropriately accessible. But you don't have to for the regulations. But that doesn't, as I say, negate the requirements of the Equality Act. You can still get somebody complain and say they can't access your content because it's inaccessible under the Equality Act. There are other exemptions to things like live audio and video, maps. I think it was recognised that map detail is very difficult to make accessible, but you should still, if it's something about directions, it's easy enough to make that available in text. Sometimes interactive maps are more complex and more difficult to make accessible. But I always tell people, think about what is the data you're trying to get across first before you start using a map. There are some exceptions around PDFs. So PDFs that are published before last September 2018 that are not essential for services your organisation provides. There are exemptions for heritage collections because it would be a massive burden to create a load of accessible PDFs, for example, of heritage collection, scanned documents, those sort of things. And there are some exemptions around intranets and extranets that are published before September this year. So anything published up to September this year, you don't have to make accessible. After that point, you will have to if you make major revisions or you create a new intranet or extranet. So that's the sort of exemptions, if you like. Some resources that we provide across government, and these are shared wider than central government as well. People in local authorities use these as well, but we do recommend people look at these. If you're building websites or intranets, extranets, external, internal, then you might want to look at things like design systems. GovUK has a design system that creates components and patterns that are reusable in services, and they're particularly useful for things like form controls for services. So they may not specifically apply to what you're trying to do, but there is some useful information in there. And these have all been tested and made sure that they're accessible. At the moment, to WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.0, but they are being tested in time for September to make sure they meet the new requirement of version 2.1. We also have the Government Service Manual, which is part of the Digital Service Standard, and that is used for government services, but again, it provides a lot of useful accessibility information generally. There's a whole section on accessibility and assisted digital, which is for people who may lack the confidence or the skills to use digital services. So there's things like making your service accessible, introduction, what you need to do. More interestingly, from your point of view, is probably things like understanding the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We've tried to give more of an overview. We've got a primer which helps understand some of those principles in more detail, because there is a lot of documentation in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And then there's things about testing for accessibility, the sort of things we recommend. In particular, we do recommend testing with users with disabilities. We do recommend testing with various assistive technologies. Those aren't specific requirements for the regulations, but they're a good way of checking how well you meet the requirements, and even getting a web content accessibility guidelines audit. Some auditors, some auditing organisations do testing with users with disabilities. They do testing with assistive technologies, and that's a really useful way of checking things. Certainly, in terms of the principle that things need to be robust, it's difficult to test that fully without using things like assistive technologies. I just wanted to highlight something about disabilities and impairments. Obviously, you may be aware of things like statistics on disabilities. I think it's estimated there's about 20% of the population have some form of disability. Most of the statistics that we see are related to permanent disabilities, which are ones that are classified as lasting longer than a year. But we need to think about other things like temporary and situational impairments. So this example is someone who is deaf, is a permanent disability. They would need captions on any kind of video content so they can get that information that's in the form of audio. But it could equally apply to someone with a temporary impairment like an ear infection, or someone in a noisy environment. I mean, it gives an example of a bartender, but probably a more realistic example is someone working in a cafe or trying to do something on a train, studying on a train, for example. I'm sure it happens. And noisy environments mean that, without captions, it can be very difficult to capture content. So from the point of view of designing and building things, it doesn't really matter whether you're considering a permanent, a temporary or situational impairment. They all have the same effect. So just thinking about the range of things, the range of capabilities, and the range of situational impairments that can affect people, which could be something similar in visual, in the visual field. So, for example, colour contrast. Colour contrast really helps most people, good colour contrast. And it's particularly important if you're working outdoors or in a brightly lit environment. It can be a factor then, even if you don't have a visual impairment. The Home Office, our colleagues in the Home Office came up with some posters about 3 years ago on good practice in terms of design. They wanted to make things a lot more digestible and understandable than the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So they came up with these posters, which have kind of gone viral. They're very popular, and they give some good, simple practice in terms of understanding how to make things accessible. You do still need to refer to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You do need to make sure that you're following them and you're meeting them. But these sort of things can really help get an understanding of how to do that. They've also been translated in multiple languages as well, which is a great help. Happy to take some questions at the end of the final part of the session. But in essence, a lot of this will be down to your interpretation of the regulations. I can't tell you if your site is an intranet or an extranet. I can't determine that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Richard. That's fantastic. There have been some questions in the chat already, and one that is very obvious. What I like is the monitoring you can do or will be done. It obviously can't get through authentication, presumably, isn't that be right? So if it's any testing like that can only be done on websites that are publicly available. Does that make sense? It does.
Yeah, the sampling and direct testing will be done in that way. I don't know how we're going to approach the internal stuff, the intranets, extranets, and just, as you say, anything behind any kind of registration wall. There will have to be some way of approaching that. There will have to be some means of providing access to things like that. But I don't think that's been finalised yet. But there will be.
But the rules still apply to those, yeah.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
And the other one, we keep being asked a lot, which I know you did address, is the captioning and recording of video. So that's the understanding now that anything after September 2020, it has to have subtitles and captioning. That's what the position is. Am I right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
That's good.
Okay. What I always recommend in terms of, I run training courses and things, I always recommend people think about this in terms of their workflow. So rather than getting to the point where you produce videos and then you say you want to add captions later. It's much better if you can build that into your workflow so that you know up front, because often things will have a transcript that is used to record these things, and that can be fed into producing captions. So that's a really useful tip.
That's really good. Thanks, Richard. And we'll if I keep moving on, we'll have some time at the end to get back to some of the interesting questions. Just to speaking to participants, if you're able to put a Q, the letter Q in front of the text that you write, that helps us find the question again in the chat. Just to if that would benefit us. So in this part, I'm just going to talk a little bit about accessibility statements, so that we know what they must include, and obviously the regulations come from the EU directive. They're in force already, so we have compliance to meet. In the Regulation 8 describes the legal requirements of accessibility statements. And any website published since September 2018 will need a statement by September 2019, while older websites have until 2020 to comply. And I want to look now at what exactly the statement needs to contain, where it should be found, and what needs to be in place. And if we get a chance, what the consequences are for not having the information made available. So the regulations are quite prescriptive in terms of what each individual accessibility must contain. Of course, many institutions, of course, will already have accessibility information on their websites with varying degree of detail and value. But now this is a wholly new requirement in a fairly rigid and structured format. What is required is consistency of information for the user. The statement has to be published in line with a model template, and we might come back to that. And I know there's a lot of work being done currently to make sure that the template and supporting guidance is appropriate for the kind of often complex information that's published by colleges, universities, and websites and learning environment. And we might get Richard to come back on that. So, what do the regulations say about accessibility statements? The statement needs to include an explanation of what website content is not accessible and the reasons for that. It also needs to contain a description of the accessible alternatives where appropriate. There needs to be contact details and a description of how to notify when website content fails to comply with accessibility requirement. So again, that's something that each institution has to generate for themselves and to provide themselves. And there has to be a description of the enforcement procedures. And that's all set out in Regulation 8. I think that the accessibility statement is key to this whole activity, really, because in order to, in fact, to make the essential information available and to make the appropriate declarations in the statement, you're going to have to do some sort of preparatory assessment or audit that identifies the good and the bad. There's a clear legal requirement to declare the known accessibility limitations of the content you publish online. Start by finding out what part of your websites do meet accessibility standards and which parts don't. I think that the transparency and openness that the statement demands forces us to look really at current resources and practices, how accessible they are when we publish websites and learning platforms. So this is the place to start. It's a real opportunity to review digital practice and to begin to identify what needs fixing. And as Richard said, the objective is to have transparency for those who have accessibility needs. And the use of the model encourages this consistency of accessibility information across websites, and that can only be good. Of course, the accessibility statement serves as a bare minimum. Many institutions will go a lot further and have lots more information for those who are looking for accessibility content resources. We've been asked how many accessibility statements would be needed. I suppose the answer is that, well, it very much depends on the complexity and number of the websites that you publish. Intranets and learning platforms are likely to need their own accessibility information. And remember, of course, that when the user gets to the accessibility statement, it needs to contain consistent information and itself be accessible. It also needs to be reviewed and kept up to date, which again is something which has to be addressed in the planning and rollout of this. So I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Julia Taylor, to take you through what she thinks she should happen next and how we can plan for
Yes, I'm
take it forward
here.
from here.
Thank you,
Are
John,
you there,
and
Julia?
thank you, Richard, for that comprehensive overview. There are quite a few questions in the chat pane which we'll hopefully be able to answer later on. But my role in this procedure as an accessibility and inclusion subject specialist of many years is to sort of draw it all together and to some extent to draw this section to a close so we can get on to some questions. And I wanted to start really with a question myself, which is, what has this all got to do with improvement? And the reason I'm asking this question is in the many years that I've been working in inclusion, any discussion around accessibility or inclusion with regard to digital practice is usually framed as a moral issue related only to people with disabilities and differences, so in the context of equality. And sadly, as a result of that, it's often marginalised. But I have always argued that it is essentially a quality improvement issue. Of course, we've already discussed the duties and expectations on all of your organisations to be able to demonstrate equality and diversity and inclusion at inspection in relation to access agreements and widening participation objectives, and clearly in relation to any funding that you're receiving in order to expand into underrepresented communities. And, Richard's mentioned this already. And of course, technology has a massive potential to overcome barriers for individuals who face additional challenges. But these web accessibility regulations are actually about taking away unnecessary barriers across the educational provision. And there's a really important distinction here. Richard mentioned the individual situational differences that might impact on somebody's sensory impairment. But what this web accessibility regulation intends to do is to make your web assets more accessible to as many people as possible, including those with disabilities. But it is an opportunity to take away unnecessary barriers by looking at how you use technology to deliver the educational delivery. The idea behind this is to improve the experience for all students and actually for staff, because you do have responsibilities as an employer as well under these public sector regulations. The concept here really is that better web accessibility means better usability, and that would be for everyone. And that should have positive effects way beyond students who you already know to have additional needs, although there are clearly benefits to those individuals. So what I'm making here is a clear case that this will lead to better outcomes for students. The idea being that better access to learning resources and activities on your virtual learning environment and other platforms, library platforms and so on, is going to lead to greater independence for all students, particularly those who have additional challenges. And that will actually lower the cost of supporting some of those students with additional needs. But it also means increased digital skills for them and, one would hope, better employability, so better outcomes for the students themselves. And in fact, if any student, disabled or otherwise, finds it easier to engage with their course, then I might anticipate that that will lead to better retention, higher achievement and increased satisfaction with student satisfaction with their courses. And I'd also argue, and have argued for many years, that inclusion encourages innovative teaching by building in to the teaching process and the design process the flexibility that you need to meet individual diverse needs. Teachers being encouraged to use technology to design differentiated activities that will engage the widest audience. And that's going to allow students to participate and collaborate from wherever they are, whenever it suits them. So what I'm getting at here is that this is a way of reaching students from disadvantaged, underrepresented communities. Technology is your key to engaging international students, people who are carers, mature students who have family or work responsibilities. It make it easier for people who are experiencing physical or mental ill health, those who are hard to reach or hard to engage, those that lack, for whatever reason, the confidence or background or the communication skills to participate in person, and of course those who have specific learning difficulties or different ability levels. So again, better outcomes for the larger number of students, better teaching, more innovative teaching, and probably better outcomes for teaching too. And also better outcomes for your organisation, because technology is your gateway into any new projects or new markets, and so you should be using it to anticipate and remove the barriers in order to facilitate better business development, community engagement, and to fulfil any social contracts that you're involved in. It's definitely the best way to ensure that your outreach programs, apprenticeships and work placements are properly supported and delivered with parity. In fact, it's the only way to ensure that you can expand into new markets and into wider communities without encountering unforeseen risk or possibly additional expense. These regulations are actually about good practice because they're based on introducing standards, the standards that Richard has mentioned, and clarifying who's accountable. So planning to be inclusive, this web accessibility is the best way to maximise efficiency in many respects, but it's also going to give you the best return on your digital investment, because if you put it simply, taking this kind of accessible approach is going to deliver the best experience and outcomes for the maximum number of users. So this is an argument really that it's about quality improvement. In terms of what you need to know, just to recap here, there are new requirements now regarding websites, apps, and any essential content, and Richard has done his best to give you some idea of what that actually means. The key issue here is that you are responsible for the web content that is within your control, and we will have some opportunity for slightly more in-depth questions in a moment. And again, Richard has clarified that this is in addition to the responsibilities you already have for reasonable adjustment. He's clarified that it's going to be monitored, and this of course means that you're going to have to evidence how you comply to the standards that have been mentioned, and that you will need to evaluate and therefore prioritise how you monitor and manage this compliance process, because there are timescales attached to this content. We've also heard from John about the accessibility statement and that it's now a legal requirement, and it must include what isn't compliant, why it isn't compliant, and what alternatives are available, and also who to contact, because you need a sustainable response process. And that's going to mean starting now to look at transparency, accountability, guidance and standards. So, what do you actually need to do? What I would recommend as your first priority is to create an action group that actually reflects the whole of your digital delivery or digital estate. Certainly senior management involvement, but also including those people connected with promoting what you do in marketing, anybody creating content or whoever heads up your main creating content, those managing the teaching itself and designing the curriculum, staff that are responsible for quality, the student support and learning support, IT, yes, but also assistive technology and the students themselves, including those with disabilities and differences. I'd also recommend, or we are recommending, that you start your evaluation process now if you haven't already, because you do need to identify the priorities. Richard's mentioned the timescales, and it is of course a question of balancing the importance of that content with the cost of updating it and of course its current usage is a big consideration. And it may even be worth considering an audit of you or a state. Certainly it would be a good idea to create a roadmap that can of course be updated, but begin to map out the process of moving towards compliance. Also making staff aware, and because you're going to be introducing accountability, and this obviously means that there's an implication here about developing staff skills. I would suggest that there's a need to build in inclusive digital capability, possibly into job descriptions and performance review, certainly into staff development, as well as providing the guidance and standards by which you're going to manage this process. And the fourth thing on the list there is designing your accessibility statement. And there have been several mentions of the accessibility statement template today. And it is crucial, of course, that GDS provide the template which meets the needs of the sector. But I think it's worth thinking about how you're going to design this statement at this stage prior to the template being issued. Because what you want from that statement is not just compliance, but that it should be informative and useful and as accessible as possible. And in fact, everyone that you might think of at this point of inviting into your action group could have a valuable contribution to make, because this is about joining up this kind of support that you've got available with the way that you promote it to students and make sure that they're aware of it, as well as meeting and planning for compliance. And it's quite possible that across the board, people from curriculum, people who are involved in assistive technology, and even those obviously involved in marketing and promoting externally to prospective students, the accessibility statement is an opportunity to look at that as well. I think it's also worth setting up and testing your response processes with students now. This is not just about providing a phone number, which is something that we see a lot. You actually need to respond appropriately if you're going to meet your responsibility for reasonable adjustment, because you do need to actually have an adjustment or an alternative available. And if not available, you need to be able to provide that alternative within a reasonable time frame. And once you've tested the process, you can start to begin to decide on who's going to take ongoing responsibility for maintaining compliance and accountability at each of the stages of the process. Which takes me to the last little slide here, really, which is about what we're recommending you do. Richard's pointed to some really comprehensive advice on the Government Digital Service website, and it's an ongoing situation. You'll find more and more materials appearing there. I think it's already been mentioned a couple of times in the chat pane, but also in the presentation, that there is probably a need to manage this situation by renegotiating compliance criteria into your contracts and your review processes, making sure that when you put anything out for tender or for quotations that it's clear what the requirement and what the standards need to be. There's also some advantage in looking at using web technologies rather than native mobile apps, because those will be easier to update. And build in the user testing and the feedback loop into the processes that you're actually using at the moment. And I put a link there to the Accessible ICT Procurement Toolkit, which might be of interest in that context. And I'm going to just finish off by talking about the next steps. I think John's already mentioned our very active digital accessibility regulations mailing list, which you'll be able to find information on in the useful links, but also just by taking that link that you can see in the on the slide now to the Jisc accessibility webpage. There's a lot of linked resources there, and I know Edward will be providing some more in relation to this briefing. What I wanted just to finish off with was to talk about the next steps available to you in relation to Jisc, because I think what Richard's been talking about, and he'll be able to elaborate on in a few minutes' time, are the resources that are going to be provided by Government Digital Service. Jisc has been involved with the Government Digital Service in putting together the advice, But I also wanted to draw your attention to how we propose to continue to support you. Through the webpage you can see the link to there, but also through our training delivery. Last year, the A&I subject specialist for Jisc did about 60 A&I snapshots, which were designed to test from a student perspective, a student user perspective, the accessibility of the key digital platforms that students might be expected to engage with. The website, which after all is your shop window where you showcase your culture, your prospectus, which one would expect to be welcoming all students into the application process, the VLE or MLE and the library platforms that students are going to need to rely on to be able to engage fully with their courses, and the assistive technology or productivity tools that you make available to students to help them to study independently. And we found a lot of good practice and some common barriers. And we've created an online series of training sessions, one on each of the platforms that I've mentioned, which are aimed at the appropriate audience. For example, prospectus probably has more to do with marketing staff, whereas you might expect the library platform to be of interest to library staff. Not exclusively, but the focus would be different. And the purpose of these sessions is to help you benchmark the accessibility of your own platforms, and during the session we actually explore your platforms with you and give you tools to take away to do this for yourself in your own organisation. And this is a rolling programme of training where we will be compiling a waiting list, and you are invited through that accessibility page. You can actually get in touch with, or through the training page rather, you can get in touch with Ed and the team and get your name on the waiting list for those sessions. I think that's all
Yes, indeed. Julia, thank you very much for putting the context for us. It certainly is, that's very clear what we are, and I think Richard also made a good point there in the chat that, a lot of these obligations have been around for a long time, and, although it involves a lot of change and it seems very sudden, I mean, the deadlines are there now, and it's a good opportunity for us to work towards them. You also said some very interesting stuff about making staff aware and, introducing accountability. And I noticed in the chat too, there was someone who said that they have thousands of people contributing to VLEs and to content. Not only lecturers and staff, but also students themselves and stuff where content will end up being required to be made accessible. So an awareness of, that's a very, very important point to make, and something that should be done in all institutions. That the deadlines are here. It is a requirement. Make staff aware and make them accountable. Richard has also been busy responding to some of the questions in the chat, and I think that's really the way to go. I'm very keen to hear about the model statement itself and how we're going to deal with that. I think when we get that and when we get the guidance that it will surround that hopefully will be very useful to us in the sector here trying to comply. So there's a lot of work to be done on that, and I think that we'll be making details and information about all of that on our website, the jisc.ac.uk/accessibility. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Richard, or is there anything comes to mind, having heard a lot of that chat in the chat pane? There's a whole mix of concerns and obviously a lot of enthusiasm, but there are concerns and there is some uncertainty still about what some of how the compliance will be assessed. Any thoughts on?
Yeah, I think I wanted to highlight again that some of this is going to be open to interpretation by organisations. In the regulations, it doesn't really say what an intranet is, an extranet, or even what a website is. It doesn't define that. And I think part of that is probably slightly deliberately vague because we don't know what technology is going to come around the corner and how things are going to work with AI and voice and stuff like that. different ways of interacting with technology. So it hasn't been formally defined to the nth degree, but I recognise that is frustrating for organisations to understand exactly what the regulations require. And ultimately, it does come down to their own interpretations in conjunction with lawyers if necessary. I don't want to become legalistic about it, but it does have to be decided by the organisations. And it's the same as any other kind of regulations like GDPR, the data protection regulations. It's about managing the risk of that. It's thinking what are the risks, and it's the reputational risks, legal risks, the financial risks. So I think that's the big factor for me.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I having been legally trained, that's the first thing I look at is the risk, and I think these regulations really do tie up, I suppose, where if websites and content isn't accessible, then it really is, the failure to make the accessibility requirement is a breach of the regulations, and I think it makes it much easier, I'd say, for a student to make that link to discrimination, and I think that risk has to be reevaluated by senior leaders going forward, and it has to really be brought to their attention. It's a risk that needs to be evaluated. But I do that's my first. I drift to that first thing, and I know a lot of people don't like highlighting the legal and compliance and risk areas of it, but I do think it's something that senior leaders need to understand and evaluate.
I think it's a bit like building and construction. There are a lot of regulations, there are a lot of rules, and a lot of that is about risk and things like that. But ultimately, you're in the business of producing great designs, producing great websites, producing great learning environments, and learning experiences, and that's what it's all about. And it's about making that as inclusive as possible. So long as you've got that sort of feeling behind everything, it makes it feel more logical. But I do recognise that timescales are tight and there is a lot of work to be done. And from the comments and the questions, people talk about hundreds of videos being produced a day, or 40,000 students, only a few of whom have hearing impairments. There are lots of things to consider and discuss. But it is, as I say, a lot of it is about thinking, how do we make this as inclusive as possible?
And is there anything we can say about the accessibility statement, the model, or is there anything we can, certainly in the next shortly, it will shortly be available.
That's the plan. I don't think there'll be any kind of great detail in those. It will help understand how to produce this, but the principles you went through about what you need to include in it, about the things that aren't accessible and why, and what we're going to do about it, and things about reasonable adjustments. It's a lot of it is common sense, I think, and I don't think it's going to be as big a burden as people might think. I think the bigger burden is actually making things accessible. The statement is important, but I think that's going to be easier to define, if you like.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Richard, and that's a great contribution. It's been very useful for me to hear what you have to say, and also to hear some of the concerns in the questions and chats. The time is finished for this, but as Julia has pointed out, we have further information, events, and training which is available to you. We have a very useful one on the first Wednesday of every month, a drop-in clinic, a free drop-in clinic, where there's a link to that also from the Jisc website, where you can share your concerns and share your expertise and share knowledge on how we're going to take this forward. And I think we'll call it to a halt there, and thank you very much for participating. Any of the questions that are outstanding, I'll be collecting them and putting them together, and they'll feed into all of the work that we're doing. I'm sure Richard will say the same. They'll inform the work that he's doing.
Yeah,
Thank
just
you very
mentioned
much.
in the chat
And
there,
Edward,
you might have
that's
seen
all
my
we need to do now.
comment about the fact that if your question hasn't been answered today, obviously due to GDPR constraints in terms of your data protection, we can't use your email addresses to reply to you directly, with obviously like your consent, which hasn't been taken for this briefing. So if you've got any further questions or your question wasn't answered, then the contact details for the trainers today are there, which you can use and follow that up with them offline. Equally, there was a question about whether we're going to be repeating this briefing or there are going to be more briefings like this, and I mentioned the potential for that, so that's something we can discuss afterwards, John. Yeah, there was a lot of questions. As I say, they'll certainly colour the information that then gets put forward for any further briefing and any updates on this information. But yeah, other than that, it just leads us to thank you, John, thank you, Julie, and thank you, Richard, for attending the for presenting the briefing. For everybody else for attending, we do hope you found it beneficial, and you just need to close your tab or window and that lock you out. Yes, Roger, there are lots of questions outstanding, as I say, and if you have an outstanding question, please do email the presenters, and hopefully they'll get a timely reply back to you. And apologies that we ran out of time there. The slides, Ian, they are available, and you said it'd be helpful to have a PowerPoint copies of the slides available so that you can take them for circulation. Yes, I can make those available with the authorization from the trainers, and we'll put that with the recording up on the page that advertised the briefing originally, which I put in the main chat pod, but I'll put here too on there. Other than that, thanks very much. Have a good rest of the afternoon. Thanks for coming.